It happened without warning. Not a tear in the warp, not the golden light of an Imperial strike force, but a sudden, impossible silence in a small patch of the battlefield. A section of the orc horde, 100 strong, simply vanished. In their place, with a sound like a dropped textbook, a small, ridiculously plain structure of prefabricated plasteel and cheap rockcrete slammed into the mud. It looked like a HAB unit from some forgotten hive block, complete with a small balcony and a satellite dish. The battle around it raged on, but for a moment the sheer absurdity of its appearance created a pocket of confusion. The war boss, Gutrecka himself, skidded to a halt, his metallic jaw unhinging in a guttural query. Then the door to the HAB unit slid open. A man stepped out onto the balcony dressed in a garish yellow suit with red gloves and boots and a simple white cape. He was bald, with a placid, almost bored expression on his face that was so utterly alien to the surrounding carnage that it felt like a blasphemy. He held a plastic grocery bag in one hand. He blinked, looking down at the million-strong orc army, then up at the shell-pocked sky, and let out a small sigh of utter disappointment. "Oh man, not again," he muttered to no one. Gutrecka saw the bald figure not as an anomaly but as a challenge. Here was a new, brightly colored Umi to Crump, one who dared look bored in the face of the mightiest War. This side of the segmentum solar. With a roar that shook the very earth, the war boss pointed his power claw. "Get him, boys! Tear the shiny git apart!" The meganobs around him, walking tanks of metal and rage, fired their shooters. A storm of lead and explosive shells enough to shred a Lehman Russ tank converged on the balcony. The cheap structure was obliterated in a cloud of dust and shrapnel. But when the smoke cleared, the man was still standing there untouched, the grocery bag still swinging gently from his hand. He looked down at a single smudge of soot on his red glove and frowned slightly, wiping it on his cape. He then stepped off the remnants of his balcony, landing softly in the mud below. Gutrecka charged, his power claw crackling with disruptive energy, a weapon that could tear apart the fabric of reality itself. He swung, aiming to cleave the man in two. The man turned his head slightly and raised a single gloved fist. He did not seem to strain or even focus. It was a casual, almost lazy movement. His fist connected with the center of the war boss's chest. There was no sound at first, not an explosion, not a crack of thunder, just a sudden, total cessation of noise. Gutrecka, the beast who had slain titans and butchered space marines, simply ceased to exist. A fine red mist, instantly vaporized by the sheer kinetic force, was all that remained. But the effect did not stop there. A shockwave, perfectly silent and utterly devastating, erupted from the point of impact. It was not fire or energy, but pure, unstoppable force. The meganobs behind Gutrecka, the battle wagons, the deft dreads, the tens of thousands of orcs in a perfect conical radius behind where the war boss once stood, were all erased from existence. They did not fly apart. They were atomized, their bodies and machines turned into a cloud of organic and metallic dust that was pushed outward by the silent wave. The battlefield fell quiet. The roar of the Wah, a constant presence for weeks, was gone. The surviving orcs, millions of them, stood frozen, their primal minds unable to process the utter, instantaneous annihilation of their leader and the heart of their army. Commissar Valerius lowered his magnoculars, his knuckles white. The hololith in his bunker was a sea of static. He had witnessed horrors beyond mortal comprehension, seen demons crawl from the warp and men melt under Xeno's plagues. He had never, in his 50 years of service, seen anything like this. One man, one punch, and then silence. Across the newly silent battlefield, the green tide wavered. Orc hierarchy is a simple, brutal calculus of might, and their psychic gestalt, the very essence of the Wa, required a sufficiently powerful leader to focus its energy. That leader was now a microscopic dusting of atoms spread across a kilometer of blasted mud. The orcs looked from the empty space where Gutreka had been to the lone, bald figure in the ridiculous yellow suit. Their tiny red eyes held not fear but a profound instinctual confusion. Their momentum was gone, the joyous crescendo of violence broken. A squabble broke out on the left flank as two knobs, seeing a power vacuum, immediately began bashing each other's heads in. The psychic roar that had pressed down on the minds of the Cadian defenders for weeks sputtered and died, replaced by a disorganized rabble of individual war cries and infighting. The great green wave had broken not against a fortress wall, but against a pebble of absolute indifference. The man in yellow, Saitama, finally looked away from the dissipating dust cloud and glanced into his grocery bag. He pulled out a carton of eggs. Miraculously, none were broken. A small, genuine smile briefly touched his lips. "Okay. Good," he said to himself, his voice swallowed by the sheer scale of the landscape. From his perch, Commissar Valerius felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the Xenos threat. The battle was over. The orcs were routing, devolving into a chaotic mob that his men could now encircle and exterminate at their leisure. Viridia Satu was saved. But the nature of their salvation was a heresy of such magnitude that it threatened to eclipse the initial invasion. He watched the bald man wander aimlessly for a moment, occasionally kicking a piece of orc scrap metal with a dull clang. This was no manifestation of the Emperor's will. There was no golden light, no righteous fury, no soaring hymns. There was only a man in a silly costume who had just displayed power on a level Valerius had never conceived of, and who now seemed primarily concerned with the state of his groceries. "Sergeant Cove," Valerius spoke into his vox, his voice a low, steady growl that betrayed none of his internal turmoil. "Take your Kasserkin squad, full armament. We are making contact. All other units begin cleansing protocols on the remaining greenskins. Maintain a cordon. Nothing gets within a kilometer of the anomaly, and by the Throne Cove, sanctioning protocols are authorized if it shows even a hint of hostility." A crackle of static and a simple, "Acknowledged, Commissar," was the reply. Saitama was trying to figure out where he was. The air smelled bad, like smoke and burnt meat. The ground was all torn up, and there were big, ugly green guys fighting each other everywhere. It looked a lot like one of the monster attacks from back home, but bigger and somehow more pointless. He hoped he hadn't been thrown into another dimension again. That was always a pain to get back from. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the 10 soldiers approaching him until they were a few dozen meters away. They were dressed in impressive-looking armor, carrying large, boxy guns with an air of lethal professionalism. The man leading them wore a long black coat and a peaked cap, his face a mask of grim determination, a pistol with a golden eagle on it held firmly at his side. They fanned out, creating a perfect semicircle of overlapping fire zones. It was a very well-executed maneuver. "Identify yourself, anomaly," the man in the coat commanded, his voice amplified by a small voxcaster on his collar. It was sharp, cold, and carried an absolute authority that had sent thousands of men to their deaths. "By the authority of the God Emperor of mankind and his Holy Inquisition, you will state your designation and purpose on this imperial world." Saitama just stared at him, tilting his head. He didn't understand half of those words. I'm Saitama," he said, his tone flat and devoid of any grandeur. "I'm a hero for fun. Say, do you know if there's a supermarket around here? I need to get some kombu for a hot pot." The 10 Kasserkin elite troopers behind Valerius flinched as one. The commissar's face, already pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. The response was so mundane, so utterly disconnected from the reality of their situation, that it was more terrifying than any demonic roar or Xenos threat. This being had just wielded power enough to shatter armies, and it was asking for soup ingredients. It was not speaking Gothic. It was not speaking any known dialect of humanity or Xenos. Yet the meaning was somehow clear, translated through some bizarre psychic or linguistic happenstance. Valerius's mind raced through every known classification of threat. It was not a demon. It felt of nothing, a void in the warp. It was not a typical psyker. The air around it was dead, without a hint of Empyrean energy. It was a physical entity of impossible power and apparently impossible stupidity. "Your jest is heresy," Valerius stated, his finger tightening on the trigger of his bolt pistol. The weapon was a holy relic, its blessed rounds capable of blowing a hole in ceramite. He knew with a certainty that chilled his soul that it would do nothing against this creature. "You will submit to examination. Lay down your groceries and kneel." Saitama's placid expression finally shifted into one of mild annoyance. "Look, I'm not looking for trouble," he said, shifting the bag to his other hand. "I just want to get my shopping done and go home. You can go back to your war or whatever this is." He then turned his back on the commissar and the 10 aimed hellguns and began to walk away. An act of defiance so profound, so casual. It was a greater insult to imperial authority than any traitor's sermon. For a Cadian shock trooper, the word of a commissar is law, second only to the emperor's distant will. To ignore a direct command is to invite the cleansing fire of a summary execution. To turn one's back is to spit on 10,000 years of tradition and sacrifice. Sergeant Cove did not even wait for the order. He saw the commissar's expression, a rictus of incandescent fury and utter disbelief, and he gave the command himself. "Fire!" The air crackled as 10 hellguns discharged at once. Bright lances of crimson energy, each shot powerful enough to boil a man alive in his flak armor and punch through the hull of a chimera, converged on the back of the yellow-suited figure. The volley was perfectly aimed, a concentrated storm of destruction that should have left nothing but a charred crater and the smell of ozone. The energy splashed against Saitama's white cape and dissipated with a gentle hiss like water on a hot plate. There was no impact, no kinetic transfer, not even a ripple in the fabric. He continued walking, his pace unhurried. For a moment he paused and the Kazarkan tensed, expecting a counterattack of unimaginable speed. He simply reached up and scratched his bald head. The noise was a little annoying. Valerius's mind broke. Not in a screaming, gibbering way that would require the mercy of his own bolt pistol. It was a quieter, more terrifying fracture. The universe, as he understood it, had been built on a foundation of unshakable truths. Faith in the Emperor, the perfidy of the Xenos, the weakness of the heretic, and the immutable laws of physics that governed warfare. A hellgun volley vaporized flesh. An orc was strong. A man could be killed. This thing violated all of it. It did not resist the energy. It simply ignored its existence. With an act of pure, desperate faith, Valerius raised his holy bolt pistol, the Emperor's Mercy, and fired. The mass-reactive shell, a miniature rocket propelled by faith and fury, crossed the distance in a heartbeat and struck Saitama squarely between the shoulder blades. The bolt detonated with a deafening crack, a bloom of fire and shrapnel designed to tear apart a Chaos Space Marine. The explosion kicked up a cloud of mud and briefly obscured the target. When it cleared, the man was still there. His yellow suit was pristine. His cape was unfrayed. He stopped walking and slowly turned around, his face now set in an expression of genuine, unmistakable irritation. "Hey, could you knock it off?" he said, his voice flat. "I'm trying to walk here. I think I saw some lights over that hill. Maybe it's a city. Seriously, it's rude to shoot people in the back." He took a step towards them. It was not a charge, not a threatening advance, just a single placid step. But in that instant, the 10 elite Kasrkin, veterans of 100 brutal engagements, felt a primal terror grip their souls. It was not the fear of a charging carnifex or the psychic dread of a warp entity. It was the simple, logical fear of an ant realizing it has just tried to stop a landslide. Their training, their faith, their very sanity screamed that this was an enemy they could not fight, could not comprehend. One trooper, his nerve broken, squeezed his trigger again in a panicked burst. Saitama sighed, a long put-upon sound. He vanished. Not in a blur of speed, but as if he had simply ceased to be in one location and begun to be in another. He reappeared directly in front of the panicked Kasrkin, his blank face inches from the soldier's visor. The soldier froze, his finger still locked on the trigger of a weapon that was now utterly useless. Saitama gently took the hellgun from the man's hands, the soldier's armored gauntlets offering no resistance. "This is dangerous," Saitama said, holding the weapon up. He then tightened his grip. The gun, a master-crafted weapon of plasteel, adamantium, and sacred machine spirits, crumpled in his fist like a cheap can, twisting into a gnarled, smoking ball of scrap. He dropped it in the mud with a wet squelch. Then he looked past the soldier, at the commissar. "Okay, now I'm getting mad," he said, his voice still flat, yet somehow carrying a weight that made the very air feel heavy. Commissar Valerius stood frozen, his mind a maelstrom of fear and duty. The 10 Kasrkin, the finest soldiers the Cadian 814th could field, remained motionless, their discipline the only thing keeping them from breaking and running. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The bald man Saitama stared at them for a long, silent moment. The flicker of anger in his eyes faded, replaced once again by that profound, unnerving boredom. He had crushed their weapon, demonstrated his invulnerability, and shown a speed that broke the laws of motion. He had made his point. With another sigh, one that seemed to carry the weight of infinite disappointment, he turned away from them again. "Whatever," he said, the single word an epitaph for their entire understanding of warfare. "Just leave me alone." He crouched slightly, bending his knees. The ground beneath his red boots cracked, the mud compressing into something as hard as diamond. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap that was somehow completely localized to the space he occupied, he launched himself into the air. He did not fly. He jumped. He ascended in a straight vertical line with such impossible velocity that he was a yellow speck in the sky within a second, disappearing into the soot-stained clouds moments later. A full minute passed before a sonic boom, a concussive wave of displaced atmosphere finally washed over the battlefield, flattening tents and rattling the teeth of every soldier on the planet. Valerius did not lower his gaze from the empty sky for a long time. The foundations of his universe had been systematically dismantled in the span of 10 minutes. He had been trained to fight the horrors of the galaxy, to recognize the taint of chaos, the cunning of the Eldar, the brutality of the Orc. The training manuals had no chapter for this. The Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer had no inspirational quote for a foe who could not be harmed and who treated a battle for a world as a minor inconvenience. His duty, however, remained. It was a cold, hard thing, the only solid piece of reality he had left to cling to. He keyed his personal long-range Vox, bypassing all local command channels and sending a coded high-priority burst directly to the Segmentum command on Cypra Mundi. He knew it would be intercepted by the sleepless, watchful eyes of the Inquisition long before it reached the Administratum. He hoped it would be. "Commissar Anton Valerius, Cadian 814th, he began, his voice hoarse but steady. "Reporting from Viridia 2. The Xenos threat has been neutralized. I repeat, the Wa has been broken." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "By a single non-imperial entity of unknown origin. Designation, Anomaly yellow. Threat classification. Transcendent. Conventional arms, including blessed bolt rounds, are sub-ineffective. Exhibited kinetic force capable of atomizing heavily armored Xenos targets in a wide dispersal pattern. Motility exceeds all known Imperial or Xenos capabilities. Nature appears ontological. Request immediate inquisitorial intervention. The Emperor protects. He finished the transmission and stood in the silence, feeling the weight of that last, desperate word. Ontological. Not a creature to be fought, but a fundamental law of the universe that had just been rewritten. In the cold, silent void 100,000 kilometers above Viridia 2, the signal was received. Aboard the inquisitorial black ship Divine Censure, a vessel cloaked from all mundane sensors, the message scrolled across a data slate held in a slender, augmetic hand. Inquisitor Lyra Kask of the Ordo Xenos read the transmission twice, her expression unreadable behind a polished silver mask that covered the right side of her face. She was a woman of 2 centuries, her original body a distant memory, replaced piece by piece with cold, efficient machinery in service to the Golden Throne. She had seen 1,000 worlds and 1,000 horrors, and her capacity for surprise had been surgically removed long ago. Yet as she read Valerius's report, a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, stirred in the databanks of her mind. Ontological, she whispered, the word a soft hiss from her vocalizer. She tapped a command into her throne-like command chair. Helm, retrieve all picked captures from the Commissar's chrono feed. Filter for anomaly yellow. I want auspex readings, atmospheric displacement data, everything. The ship's machine spirit complied instantly. Images flickered across the large holithic display before her. A blurry yellow shape, a silent explosion of red mist, a storm of hellgun fire splashing harmlessly against a white cape. Then came the final high-fidelity capture of the being crushing a hellgun, its face locked in an expression of mild pique. Inquisitor Kask leaned forward, her one organic eye narrowing. This was not a weapon. This was not a demon. This was something else entirely. Something new. And in the 41st millennium, anything new was either a heresy to be purged or a power to be seized. Pilot, she commanded, her voice now cold and sharp as obsidian. Prepare a cohort of Tempestus scions for immediate planetfall. Objective is not engagement, it is observation and, if possible, capture. I want this Saitama alive. Saitama landed with a heavy thud that cracked the ferrocrete of a wide processional way, sending spiderwebs of fractures across the engraved image of a 2-headed eagle. He had aimed for the cluster of lights he'd seen from the battlefield, and his jump, perhaps a little stronger than intended, had carried him clear across the continent. The lights, he now realized, were from a city, but it was unlike any city he had ever seen. Gargantuan, mountain-sized structures clawed at the perpetually overcast sky, their peaks lost in the thick yellow-brown smog. Rivers of acidic rain cascaded down their sides, staining the ornate carvings of skeletal figures and forgotten saints with streaks of black. Millions of people, a shuffling, gray-faced river of humanity, moved through the canyons between these man-made mountains, their heads bowed, their expressions a uniform mask of weary resignation. The air was thick with the smell of recycled air, industrial pollutants, and a faint cloying scent of incense. There were no bright colors, no advertisements, no sounds of laughter. There was only the distant tolling of bells, the marching of armored patrols, and the monotonous hum of immense ancient machinery. Saitama looked at the oppressive vista, his brow furrowed in thought. Well, he said to the city at large, this place looks depressing. He adjusted his grocery bag and began to walk, a beacon of garish yellow in a world of gray and bronze. He was looking for something familiar, a storefront, a commercial district, anything that might point him towards a market. But every archway led to another identical street choked with shuffling masses. Every building was adorned with skulls. The people he passed gave him a wide berth, their eyes sliding away from him. In a society where any deviation from the norm could attract the attention of the authorities, a bald man in a bright yellow hero costume was not just strange. He was a danger to be avoided. Saitama, for his part, was oblivious to the undercurrent of fear. He was used to being ignored. He tried asking for directions a few times. "Excuse me," he said to a man whose face was a mass of ritual scars. The man flinched and hurried away, muttering a prayer to the emperor. "Hey," he tried again, tapping a woman on the shoulder. She gasped and scurried into the crowd as if he had burned her. Saitama sighed. Tough crowd. He was so focused on his quest for groceries that he failed to notice the subtle, shimmering distortions in the air on the rooftops above him, or the tiny insect-like servo skulls that detached from the shadows to follow his progress from a safe distance. High above, clinging to the side of a gargoyle-encrusted chapel, Tempester Prime Alaric adjusted the multispectral lens of his helmet. His squad of 10 scions was perfectly positioned, their camo cloaks rendering them all but invisible against the grimy Gothic architecture. "Valkyrie 1 to Divine Censure," he subvocalized, his voice a calm, professional whisper. "Target is proceeding through Hab Sector Gamma 9. He is on foot, making no hostile moves. He appears aimless. We are detecting no discernible warp signature, no bioemissions beyond baseline human, no energy readings of any kind. He is a ghost to the augurs, my lady." Aboard her ship, Inquisitor Kask absorbed the report, her silvered face illuminated by the halithic display tracking the scions' positions. A ghost. Impossible. Everything in the materium had a signature, a presence. To have none at all was a different kind of power. "He is attempting to communicate with the local populace," Alaric continued. "They are unreceptive. He shows no frustration, no readable emotional state beyond a baseline of what my psychoanalytic suite is flagging as apathy." Kask's organic eye narrowed. Apathy, after displaying the power to annihilate an army. The contradiction was fascinating. "Maintain observation, Tempester Prime," she ordered. "I want to know what it wants. Every entity wants something. Find its purpose." "Acknowledged, Inquisitor," Alaric replied, just as a new variable entered the equation below. A 3-man patrol of the Adeptus Arbites, the local enforcers of imperial law, rounded a corner. They were large men, their bodies bulked up by vat-grown muscle and encased in black carapace armor, their faces hidden behind merciless, impassive helmets. They saw Saitama instantly. His bright costume was an affront to the mandated drudgery of the hive. "Citizen," the lead arbitrator barked, his voice a metallic rasp from his helmet grill. "Halt! Present your identification sigil and work unit designation." Saitama stopped and turned. "Oh, hey, I don't have any of that," he said plainly. "I'm new here." The arbitrators exchanged a look. New here was not a concept in a hive city. You were born here, you worked here, you died here. "Vagrancy and unauthorized livery," the lead officer declared, pulling a heavy power maul from his belt. The weapon began to hum, its disruptive energy field crackling to life. "You will submit to judgment." The 3 officers advanced, ready to administer a public, brutal lesson in compliance. From his perch, Alaric tensed, his finger hovering over the trigger of his hellgun. His orders were to observe, but if the anomaly was provoked, what would happen? He was about to find out. The lead arbitrator, confident in his authority and the crackling power field of his maul, swung the weapon in a wide, brutal arc aimed at Saitama's head. The air hummed, the weapon designed to collapse matter on impact. For the shuffling citizens of the hive, this was a familiar sight. The swift, final judgment of imperial law. They averted their eyes, not wanting to witness the inevitable bloody conclusion. From his vantage point, Tempester Prime Alaric recorded every microsecond. Saitama did not dodge. He did not brace himself. He simply raised his red-gloved hand, palm open, and caught the head of the power maul as it reached maximum velocity. The expected explosion of gore and energy never came. Instead, the loud hum of the weapon died with a pathetic fizzle, the disruptive power field shorting out against his skin. The arbitrator was left frozen, his arms trembling from the kinetic shock of a stopped blow. His 2-ton weapon held effortlessly in the grip of this strange, bald man. "This is a really weird-looking hammer," Saitama observed, his voice calm. He squeezed. The adamantium-laced head of the power maul buckled and warped, crumpling with a groan of protesting metal. He then gently pushed the weapon and the officer attached to it backward. The arbitrator stumbled, looking down at his now useless mangled symbol of authority with incomprehensible horror. The other 2 officers reacted as their training dictated, flanking the target to attack from multiple angles. One swung his shock maul at Saitama's legs while the other drew a stub carbine. Saitama sighed again, the sound of a man being forced to deal with tedious paperwork. Before the second maul could connect, he tapped the officer on the top of his helmet with a single finger. The officer's entire body spun around like a top for 3 full rotations before he collapsed in a dizzy, clattering heap. The third arbitrator, seeing his comrades defeated in the span of 2 seconds, hesitated for a fatal moment. Saitama appeared in front of him, plucked the carbine from his hands, and casually bent the barrel into a perfect 90-degree angle. He then handed the ruined firearm back to the speechless officer. "You guys should really stop pointing these things at people," Saitama advised, his tone more like a disappointed teacher than a combatant. "It's not polite." He then turned his back on the defeated patrol, adjusted his grocery bag once more, and continued his walk down the processional, leaving behind 3 agents of imperial law utterly broken, not by violence, but by sheer dismissive impossibility. The surrounding crowd, which had instinctively recoiled, now stared in a mixture of terror and awe. Nothing and no one defied the Arbites. Not and lived. "Report, Valkyrie 1, Inquisitor Kask's voice commanded in Alaric's ear, sharp and immediate. The Tempester Prime took a moment to process the data, his professional calm warring with the sheer absurdity of what he had just witnessed. "My lady, the anomaly engaged the Arbites patrol," he reported, his voice tight. "Neutralized 3 hostiles in under 5 seconds. 0 casualties. I repeat, 0 casualties. The hostiles are incapacitated but alive. It disabled a power maul through direct physical contact. The weapon's energy field was nullified on impact. It demonstrated localized superhuman speed and precision. Its strength is incalculable. It bent a carbine barrel with its bare hands." He paused, reviewing the final picked capture of Saitama's face. "The most alarming detail, Inquisitor, is its disposition. It displayed no malice, no anger, only mild irritation. It treated the entire encounter as a nuisance." The implications of his report hung in the silent void between the planet and the divine censure. This was not a mindless beast or a raging demon. It was a controlled, thinking entity with power that seemed to have no upper limit, and it could not be provoked into revealing a weakness. Aboard her ship, Lyra Kask leaned back in her command throne, the silver side of her face reflecting the hololithic replays. Her scions were the best conventional soldiers in the segmentum, but they were useless here. The Astra Militarum would be a blood sacrifice. Even the Adeptus Astartes, the mighty space marines, would likely find their bolters and chainswords equally ineffective. Brute force was not the answer. This required a different tool altogether, a key for a lock that defied normal geometry. She could order a Vindicare assassin to put a turbo-penetrator round through its skull, but she had no doubt it would simply bounce off. She could unleash an Eversor, but its chemical rage would be pitiful against a being that felt no pain. No, this required subtlety. It required an approach that operated outside the known laws of physics and warfare. It required an agent who could get close, who could test the anomaly's nature in ways a gun never could. "Machine spirit," she commanded her, voice low and resonant with finality. "Open a priority channel to the Officio Assassinorum Clade Calidus. Authorization code, Cask Omega Crimson. I have a target that requires acquisition. Send the request to Temple Command on Terra. The asset will need to be the best they have." A soft chime acknowledged the command. A request of that level was rarely made and never refused. Far across the galaxy, in the shadowed halls of the Assassin's Temple, a new mission file was being opened, and a shape-shifting master of infiltration and death was about to be given the most impossible target of her career. Deep within the sanctified adamantium shell of the divine censure, a ghost took shape. Before Inquisitor Cask, a hololithic image shimmered into existence, a slender, black-clad figure whose face was a featureless mask. This was not a real-time transmission. Communication with the Officio Assassinorum was never so crude. It was a pre-recorded acceptance of the mission, a promise delivered from the heart of Terra itself. The figure's voice, when it spoke, was a synthesized amalgam of 100 different voices, perfectly anonymous and utterly chilling. "The requisition is acknowledged, Inquisitor Cask. Asset 9 Delta 9 of the Calidus Temple is deployed. Her operational parameters are set. She will infiltrate, analyze, and uncover a vulnerability in the target designated Anomaly Yellow. All methods are sanctioned. All collateral damage is acceptable. The Emperor's will be done." The image faded, leaving Cask alone in the cold silence of her command deck. She had just unleashed one of the most dangerous living weapons in the Imperium, a shape-shifting blade that had toppled planetary governments and slain renegade Primarchs. Now that blade was being sent to probe a man who was concerned about hot pot ingredients. The absurdity was not lost on her, but in her line of work, absurdity was often just another word for an undiscovered lethal truth. Asset 9 Delta 9, whose birth name was a forgotten whisper in a file buried on Holy Terra, experienced the journey to Viridia 2 as a series of disconnected sensory inputs within a stasis coffin. When she awoke in a hidden substation deep within the Hive City's infrastructure, she was already processing the mission data. She watched the picked captures of Saitama, not as a warrior but as a puzzle. She saw the casual destruction of the Orc war boss and discarded it as useless data. It only confirmed his strength, which was a given. She focused instead on the smaller moments, the way he checked his grocery bag, the sigh of disappointment, the flat, uninspired look in his eyes. She saw his interaction with the Arbites, the finger tap that sent a man spinning, the bored expression as he bent a gun barrel. Her mind, a finely honed weapon of psychological warfare, came to a terrifying conclusion. The anomaly wasn't a god pretending to be a man. It was a man who happened to be a god and who found the entire experience tedious. How could you threaten a being who seemed to fear nothing? How could you bribe a being who seemed to want nothing? How could you deceive a being who seemed too simple to have any complex beliefs to exploit? The answer was, you couldn't. Not directly. You had to approach the puzzle from the side. You had to find the one thing he was looking for, the one mundane thread in his tapestry of impossible power, and pull it. Saitama had finally found something that resembled a market. It was deep in the Underhive, a sprawling, chaotic cavern lit by fungus globes and the flickering neon of unlicensed workshops. The air was thick with the steam of nutrient paste vendors, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the sizzle of roasted vermin. Here, in the lawless depths, his strange costume drew less attention. The underhive was full of mutants, gangers, and madmen. He was just one more piece of strange driftwood in a sea of human misery. His stomach rumbled. He had been so focused on finding a supermarket that he hadn't eaten since he couldn't even remember. He spotted a stall selling bowls of steaming grayish noodles run by a cheerful-looking old woman with a kind, wrinkled face. It wasn't kombu, but it would have to do. "Excuse me," he said, walking up to the stall. "How much for a bowl?" The old woman looked up, her eyes twinkling. "For a brave hero like you, sonny? The first one's on the house," she said, her voice warm and grandmotherly, a sound as out of place in the underhive as a blooming flower. She ladled a generous portion of noodles into a chipped ceramic bowl and handed it to him with a smile. Saitama blinked, surprised by the first act of genuine kindness he'd encountered in this world. "Oh, thanks," he said, taking the bowl. He sat on a nearby crate and began to eat. The noodles tasted like recycled cardboard, but the warmth was comforting. The old woman watched him, her smile never wavering. Her eyes, however, were cold, black, and analytical, recording every detail. Asset 9 Delta 9 had made contact. "It's not often we see a new face down here," the old woman said, wiping down her counter with a rag. "Especially one with so much color." Her tone was light, conversational. Saitama shrugged, swallowing a mouthful of the bland noodles. "Yeah, I'm not from around here, just trying to find my way." He decided not to mention his apartment being dropped in the middle of a battle. It was too weird to explain. "I'm looking for a supermarket, actually, a big one. Need to pick up a few things for a hot pot." The assassin's internal processors flagged the repeated phrase, hot pot, a mundane ritual, a tether to his previous reality. This was the key. "Ah, a supermarket," she sighed, a wistful look on her face. "You won't find anything like that down here, dearie, not anymore. This hive, it drains the life from everything. All we have are corpse starch and nutrient paste. I try to make it taste nice, but..." She gestured to the gray slop in his bowl. "There's only so much you can do." Saitama nodded in complete agreement. "Tell me about it." "There is a place, though," she said, leaning forward conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a whisper. "High up, near the spire. They call it the Empyrean Bazaar. It's an old market from before the smog got so bad. They say you can still get real food there, grown under sun lamps, vegetables, meats, maybe even the kombu you're looking for." She was painting a picture of a paradise tailored to his specific simple desire. A bright, clean, well-stocked grocery store. "The Arbites don't go there much. It's a place for the rich, but a clever fellow like yourself, you could probably find your way in." Saitama's eyes lit up for the first time since he'd arrived. For real? A market with actual food? This was the best news he'd heard all day. Finally, a clear objective. Before he could ask for directions, however, a new presence made itself known. A group of 5 gangers, their bodies covered in crude tattoos and their faces a mess of piercings and scars, swaggered up to the stall. Their leader, a brute with a mechanical arm that sparked and words, slammed a metal fist on the counter. "Oi, Granny," he sneered, his voice a low growl. "Looks like you got a new customer. Business must be good. Means you're ready to pay your protection fee to the scrap skulls." The old woman immediately transformed. Her cheerful demeanor vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror. She shrank back, her hands trembling. "Please, Gorgon," she whimpered. "Times are hard. I have nothing." It was a perfect performance. Asset 9 Delta 9 was channeling every frail, terrified victim she had ever studied. It was a test. Would the anomaly protect a helpless innocent? Would it reveal more of its capabilities when provoked on behalf of another? The ganger, Gorgon, laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Nothing? Then we'll take it out of your stock. He reached out with his mechanical claw, aiming to sweep the noodle pot to the ground. Saitama, who had been quietly finishing his bowl, held up a single hand. Hey! His voice was quiet, but it cut through the market's din. Gorgon stopped, turning his sneering face to Saitama. What did you say, Baldy? Saitama stood up, placing his empty bowl carefully on the counter. She gave me free food, he said, his expression completely serious. It's not nice to bully people who give you free food. Gorgon stared at him for a second, then burst out laughing. You hear that, boys? The shiny git thinks he's a hero. He swung his mechanical arm, not at the old woman, but at Saitama's head. I'll show you what we do to heroes down here. Saitama didn't even look at the incoming attack. He flicked the ganger's metal forehead with his middle finger. The tink sound was barely audible. Gorgon's eyes went wide, not in pain, but in sheer, uncomprehending shock. His entire body, all 200 kilograms of muscle and metal, was lifted off the ground. He flew backward in a perfectly straight line, not tumbling but rigid as a board, soaring over the heads of the stunned market-goers. He crashed through a wall of corrugated metal 100 meters away, with a distant comical crump. The other 4 gangers stared at the new man-shaped hole in the wall, then back at Saitama, who was now just standing there looking at his finger. He hadn't even put any effort into it. One of them dropped his pipe wrench with a clatter. Another started to back away slowly. Saitama just gave them his blank stare. So are we done here? The gangers turned and fled, tripping over each other in their haste to get away. The market was silent for a moment before the buzz of activity slowly returned, the citizens doing their best to pretend they hadn't seen anything. The old woman looked up at Saitama, her eyes wide with manufactured awe and gratitude. Oh, thank you, brave hero, she cried. You saved me about that market. You must let me thank you properly. Let me give you the directions. It's the least I can do. The old woman sketched a crude map on a piece of flak paper, her hands appearing frail and slightly shaky. Here, Sonny, she said, pressing it into Saitama's hand. It's a bit of a climb, but you take this service lift here past the corpse grinders in Sector Epsilon, and it will take you up to the mid-hive. From there, follow the grand processional of the martyred saint. The bazaar is just beyond the Aquila Plaza. It's a secret way. No patrols will bother you. Saitama looked at the simple map. It seemed straightforward enough. Wow, thanks a lot, Granny, he said, a genuine smile on his face. You've been a huge help. He gave her a small, awkward wave. Well, I'll get going then. Hope the rest of your day is, less eventful. He turned and started walking in the direction she had pointed, his yellow suit a rapidly disappearing dot in the gloom of the underhive, his mind already focused on the promise of a decent meal. He didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen the kindly old woman's smile vanish as if it had been surgically removed. Asset 9 Delta 9 stood perfectly still until the anomaly's presence had completely faded from her enhanced senses. The frail, stooped posture straightened, her spine aligning with the rigid precision of a soldier. The look of grandmotherly warmth in her eyes was replaced by a chilling, predatory emptiness. She picked up the chipped ceramic bowl Saitama had used, her thumb tracing its rim. A tool of manipulation, a weakness. She then closed her fist and the bowl cracked, then shattered, the pieces falling to the grimy floor. She felt nothing. Not contempt, not satisfaction, only the cold completion of a task. Her form began to shimmer, the polymorphine drug in her veins reacting to her will. The wrinkles on her face smoothed out, Her hair receded and her body reformed into its true shape. A lithe, athletic woman clad in a black sin-skin body glove, her face a mask of detached professional lethality. She tapped a nearly invisible bead behind her ear. "Asset 9 Delta 9 to Divine Censure," she whispered, her voice now a crisp, unadorned contralto. "Phase 1 complete. Psychological profile confirmed. Simplistic, goal-oriented, displays protective instincts towards perceived non-combatants. Utterly susceptible to basic social engineering. The bait has been taken. Anomaly Yellow is en route to designated containment sector 12 Helios. I estimate arrival in 27 minutes. My role is concluded. Awaiting exfiltration." Inquisitor Kask watched the confirmation rune blink on her holithic display. Asset 9 Delta 9 had performed flawlessly. The creature was being led like a grox to the slaughter into the most secure facility on the planet. Sector 12 Helios was not a market. It was a decommissioned Schola Progenium Academy, a fortress of adamantium and ceramite built to train the orphans of Imperial heroes, now repurposed for Kask's private use. Its halls were lined with null field generators, and its central chamber, a massive domed atrium, was now rigged with every sensor and scanner the Adeptus Mechanicus could provide. But Kask knew that walls and sensors were not enough. A physical trap for a being who defied physics was pointless. This was a laboratory, and the next step was to introduce a catalyst to force a reaction. She needed to know if the anomaly's invulnerability was merely skin deep. She needed to test its soul. "Lord Captain," she commanded, her voice echoing through the ship's bridge. "Signal the containment facility. Tell Warden Rex to open the obsidian cell. It is time to awaken Specimen Psi." The Lord Captain, a man who had faced fleets of Chaos warships without flinching, visibly stiffened. "My lady. Specimen Psi?" he questioned, his voice tight with apprehension. "Its psychic output is beyond categorization. We have lost a dozen sanctioned psychers just trying to maintain its containment field. Unleashing it." "Unleashing it," Kask interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument, "is the only way to ascertain the nature of our target. If Anomaly Yellow can be broken by conventional means, it is merely a curiosity. But if its mind and soul are as invulnerable as its body, then it is not a weapon. It is a god. And I will not suffer a god to walk in the Emperor's galaxy unexamined." Her one organic eye stared at the hololith, which now showed a simple yellow dot moving steadily through a complex schematic of the Hive City. "Give the order, Lord Captain." Deep beneath the surface of Hive Primus, in a chamber of absolute blackness ringed with warding runes and hexagrammic sigils, a dozen servitors began to turn massive groaning wheels. A 10-meter-thick adamantium gate slowly began to rise. From the darkness within, a psychic scream of pure, undiluted madness began to echo in the minds of every living thing for a kilometer in every direction. A scream of a being whose mind had been broken and remade into a living weapon of the Inquisition. The trap was set, the bait was on its way, and the real test was about to begin. Following the old woman's map, Saitama found the journey surprisingly easy. The service lift was huge, rattling its way up through miles of city infrastructure with a deafening groan. The Grand Processional was a vast, empty causeway wide enough to land a shuttle on, lined with colossal statues of stern-faced armored men holding swords. It was all very grand, but also very dusty and deserted. Finally, he arrived at a massive domed structure whose bronze doors, each 100 meters high and covered in intricate carvings, stood slightly ajar. This had to be the place, the Empyrean Bazaar. He slipped through the gap, and the doors boomed shut behind him with a deep final clang of locking mechanisms engaging. The sound echoed in the immense space, He was standing in a vast circular atrium, its ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. The floor was polished obsidian, and the air was clean and still. It was spotlessly, eerily clean, and completely empty. There were no stalls, no shops, no people, just a vast, silent, empty room. Saitama looked around, a confused frown on his face. Maybe I'm early? He wondered aloud. Or maybe it's closed on holidays. He sat down on the edge of a raised central dais, placed his grocery bag beside him, and decided to wait. From her command throne, Inquisitor Kask watched the scene on her hololith. The anomaly was secure. A dozen pict casters hidden in the dome's architecture gave her a perfect view. The target was showing no signs of distress or aggression. He just looked bored. "Warden Hrex," she commanded, her voice piped directly into the containment facility's control center. "The specimen is in place. Begin the test. Gradual release. I want to measure the anomaly's psychic resistance, not shatter it on the first attempt." In the control center beneath the dome, Warden Rex, a hulking man with a face like a pitted rock, nodded to his tech priests. "Disengage primary cognitive restraints," he ordered. "Let it taste the air." The priests began to chant in binary, their augmetic fingers flying across control panels. Deep beneath the dome, the psychic scream that had been tearing at the edges of reality began to change. It focused. A sliver of its consciousness, a single tendril of pure, weaponized madness, was allowed to seep through the null fields and into the atrium above. It was an invisible, intangible probe of pure psychic force, a sliver of power that could drive an entire regiment of soldiers to claw out their own eyes in terror. Saitama felt a weird tickle at the back of his neck, like the feeling you get when you think someone is watching you. The air got a little colder. He shivered, rubbing his arms. "Man, they should really turn on the heat in here," he grumbled. The tendril of psychic energy touched his mind. For Specimen Psi, a being whose entire existence was now a raging tempest of sensation, emotion, and memory, touching a new mind was like plunging into an ocean. It had touched the minds of saints and felt the blinding light of their faith. It had touched the minds of heretics and drowned in the glorious filth of their ambition. It had touched the minds of Xenos and been lost in the alien geometry of their thoughts. Every mind was a world to be explored, conquered, and broken. It braced itself for the mind of the entity that had shattered an army. It expected to find a fortress of willpower, a blazing sun of raw psychic energy, or a dark, twisted labyrinth of a warrior's soul. It plunged in, and it found a small one-room apartment. The psychic entity recoiled in sheer, unadulterated shock. This couldn't be right. It pushed forward again, its immense power forcing its way past the simple, unguarded threshold of the mind. The mental landscape did not change. It was a simple, clean apartment. A futon was rolled up in the corner. A small television was set up on the floor in front of a game console. A tiny cactus sat on the windowsill. There were no looming fortresses of will, no psychic shields, no raging emotions, no hidden depths of trauma or ambition. There was no fear to exploit, no pride to twist, no desire to inflame. There was only a profound, unshakable, and utterly mundane sense of quiet. It was like trying to start a fire by throwing a match into a vacuum. The sheer simplicity of the mental space was a defense more absolute than any psychic warding or training. The mind was not empty. It was just settled. The psychic probe, a weapon that had shattered the sanity of champions, slid harmlessly off the smooth, unblemished surface of Saitama's apathy. From the darkness of its cell, Specimen Psi let out a silent psychic shriek, not of rage, but of pure, terrified confusion. What was this thing? From the inky blackness of its cell, Specimen Sai felt the cold, urgent command of its masters boring into its consciousness. Failure is not an option. Break it. Break the anomaly. The entity gathered its power, discarding all attempts at subtlety. If the target's mind was a placid lake, it would not try to poison it. It would strike it with a tidal wave. It unleashed a raw, unfiltered torrent of pure warp stuff, a psychic barrage of undiluted terror. It projected images of blood-drenched battlefields from the Horus heresy, the laughter of thirsting gods, the writhing agony of demonic possession, the feeling of skin being flayed from bone. It was an assault designed to shatter the soul of a Primarch, an ocean of horror meant to drown any mortal mind in an instant. This raw psychic energy flooded into Saitama's consciousness, seeking to overwrite his reality with its own nightmare. It slammed into the mental landscape of his small apartment, and manifested as the television on the floor flickering to life. Saitama, who had been starting to doze off, blinked at the sudden noise. On the screen, a chaotic jumble of images played out. There were guys in big fancy armor fighting each other, lots of skulls, weird monster-looking things, and a lot of screaming. The special effects were terrible and the plot made no sense. It looked like some cheap, edgy horror movie a teenager would make. "Ugh, what is this garbage?" he muttered, looking around for a remote control. Finding none, he just focused his attention and mentally willed the channel to change. The images of cosmic war and damnation were replaced by a cheerful morning kids show about a smiling anthropomorphic toaster. In the obsidian cell, the psyker reeled as if struck. Its ultimate weapon, a vision of absolute damnation, had been dismissed as bad television. The psychic energy it had poured into Saitama's mind had not been absorbed or resisted. It had been ignored, and the rejection sent a sliver of that horrific power rebounding back into its own consciousness. For the first time in millennia, Specimen Sai felt a sliver of the terror it so gleefully inflicted on others. It tried again. It bypassed imagery and focused on direct emotional assault. It projected pure, soul-crushing despair, the weight of a dying galaxy, the futility of all struggle. In Saitama's mind, this manifested as a sudden, vague feeling that he might have left the stove on back in his real apartment. "Oh man, I hope I didn't," he thought, a brief look of concern on his face before he shrugged. "Oh well, nothing I can do about it now." The despair was dismissed. The psyker then tried temptation, whispering promises of unlimited power, of worlds to rule, of the adoration of gods. This felt to Saitama like a flood of annoying pop-up ads for cheap mobile games. He mentally clicked close on all of them. Each attempt was met with the same mundane, unbreachable wall of apathy. And with each failure, the psychic backlash intensified. The psyker was now trapped in a feedback loop, its own power reflecting off Saitama's simple mind and slamming back into its fractured psyche, amplified and focused. It was screaming, but its masters could no longer hear its pain over the roar of their own instruments. Aboard the Divine Censure, every alarm on Inquisitor Kask's command deck was blaring. Red runes flashed across the hololith. "Containment field for Specimen Sai is fluctuating," a tech priest shrieked, sparks flying from his console. "Its bio-signs are critical. No, they are beyond critical. They are paradoxical." Kask stared at the data streams, her organic eye wide with a cold, clinical horror. The energy readings from the containment facility were skyrocketing, but the energy was not emanating from the anomaly. It was all flowing back towards the obsidian cell. The anomaly was acting like a psychic mirror, a perfect reflector of Empyrean energy. She had been trying to find a crack in a wall of diamond, and had instead been using a hammer made of glass. "Warden Rex," she voxed, her voice tight with urgency. "Terminate the test. Re-engage all restraints now." From the control room below the dome, the warden's panicked voice came back, laced with static. "We are trying, my lady. The feedback is overwhelming the systems. It's by the throne, it's going to blow." Inside the atrium, the lights began to flicker violently. The polished obsidian floor cracked, and a thin black ooze began to seep from the fissures. Saitama finally stood up, looking at the ceiling. "Geez, the wiring in this place is a mess," he said, deciding he had waited long enough. He started walking towards the massive bronze doors he had entered through, intending to find a manager to complain to. He was halfway across the dome when the psychic feedback loop reached its absolute peak. Deep below his feet, the tortured mind of Specimen Sai finally collapsed in on itself. Its immense power, with nowhere to go, imploded. The last thing Inquisitor Cask saw from the picked casters was a flash of silent purple-black light that erupted from the center of the dome. Then every feed went dead.